Howdy, welcome to Module 7. We're going to continue on our adventure here, if you might call it that, with finances in our SAEs. This is continuing on for Exam 2. Remember, Exam 2 is diving really deep into these financial terms and looking at the financial backings of how these records are all entered. Don't worry, as we get further along in the course, you'll see that the AET program software package helps alleviate a lot of these concerns, and they're like, well, I'm not sure exactly if I know what where to put this or what it is or whatnot. My goal here is with these early on modules is that you will get a depth of understanding so that you understand what is happening behind the scenes in the AET. I do want to acknowledge that in looking over your discussion board for videos and responses to your peers, I did see the different concerns with double entry accounting, that debit and credit idea. And don't worry, today we are going to go into that further so that we can kind of hopefully clarify some of those concerns that you might have. We'll then talk about the assignment for this week, what it is that you're expected to do. And then, just as a note, this week I will be sending out an announcement. Sorry, I couldn't think of the words right there. Announcement for the Exam 2 review. We've got just another one more module after this, so we got another week, and then the Exam 2 will be coming up. So keep that in mind. All right, if we take a look here, I've got 3 PDF files here. They are PowerPoints that I've turned into a PDF for you, and you'll notice that they have 3 out of the 4 types of SAEs. Remember, not placement, but foundational is not in here because that money is not an aspect of a foundational project. Each of the other 3 project types do have an element of money in them. Some of them might be easier than others. We find that the most difficult aspects of the financial management typically come from the entrepreneurship project. But let's start with this research project, and let's take a look at it. The beginnings here, this is just some of the background of a research SAE and what it contains, and then we'll get down in here. Always remember, there is a plan as part of our SAEs. But now here's the section 2 documenting your research SAE in your AET record book, the finances portion. One of the things that often people think about with research is, well, it doesn't necessarily mean money. Well, to conduct research, it does take some sort of resources to conduct that. So you will have some element of research funding, which would be considered income. And then you're going to have those expenses to set up your experiment and carry out that experiment. So within that, we may have some different types of research funding. It could be cash funded from parents, resources funded by a research group, such as an employer, or a group that is interested in your research area. You might think of this as grant funding, right? You might look at, you had submit a proposal, they accept, and they fund your project because they're interested in the outcome or the results from that. If you look here, we see that these are some different cash expenses that you might incur during the research SAE. So that income that you brought in at the beginning then would be spent on these different expenses. One thing to note, that a research project is oftentimes a little backwards. We often get our research funding, our income, prior to making our expenditures going out. What I mean by that is, we would bring money in, and then we would often set up the experiment and go out and purchase those supplies that are needed. Let's take a quick thought about an entrepreneurship project. Often, you're going to go purchase the project, you're going to feed the project if it's an animal systems project, if it is a market animal. You're going to pay for those veterinary expenses and those other supplies that you might need. at the end of the project, your goal is to market and sell that animal. Your income then comes at the end. This is oftentimes backwards from what we see in research, where research is backwards from entrepreneurship. Okay, so I just want to make that clarification for you. Excuse me. So let's go back here. Oh, excuse me. I apologize about that. You'll see here we also have placement. Remember that in a placement SAE, this is our working for someone else usually. So you are going to find that money regarding a placement SAE is oftentimes a paycheck. So recording that paycheck and making accurate transactions is really the most difficult part of a placement SAE. These paychecks, as you enter them, are going to increase your assets, your cash on hand, and therefore your overall growth will grow. Okay, so that is, take a look there at the rest of that placement SAE slideshow. And our last one here is this entrepreneurship. With entrepreneurship, we often see that things get a little bit more confusing. We've got different aspects to it, including a beginning financial inventory. We'll go into that later on, but oftentimes, maybe some of you specifically, had a 4-H project before you entered into the FFA or your high school ag program, and you may have had items on hand. If you've been showing sheep for several years before you got to high school, it's likely that you had a shearing stand or a set of clippers. Maybe you had, and my students love this, lammy jammies. I know, I call them lammy jammies. Maybe you had a tube, a lamb tube, a coat, whatever, different supplies. You don't have to re-buy those into your book. In fact, there's a way that you can bring those in as a beginning inventory that you have on hand. Relating your expenses, income, sales, and then all those. There's also non-cash transactions, and we'll talk about that later, not in this module. Okay, so take a look at these different expenses that you might expect to see in your SAE for entrepreneurship. Let's shift gears here a little bit. Your assignment for this week is actually going to be in the form of doing and calculating records, financial records, in what we might refer to as the old manual fashion. And what I mean by that is we haven't always had software to conduct our accounting or our bookkeeping. If you have someone that uses QuickBooks or other software type software programs, that always hasn't always been that way. And so one of the things we're going to do is we're actually going to use Excel this week, and hopefully you have some understanding of Excel and how it works, but I've already set up all the formulas for you in the Excel sheet. But we're going to go through, and you're actually going to practice doing the double entry for some different expenses and income examples that I provided. So let's take a look at that. All right, folks, and so if we take a look here at our file here, let me zoom out a little bit so we can see it a little better. You'll see here that we have 3 different columns, and this is what we call a trial balance sheet. And this is it has a little bit of a balance sheet aspect with income statement. The income statement portion is over here in this profit and loss section. The balance sheet information comes right here from these 2 center columns, if you would. And if we think back to a basic equation that assets equals liabilities plus equity, we think about liabilities as those things that are against us. Those might be loans that we have. Those might be payments that we have outstanding, things that we owe other people or other companies. Now, equity, what is this? Well, we have earnings. Now, this is returned earnings right here in that, retained earnings, right? That's a term that we had from last week. And those retained earnings are essentially that net profit or loss. So if we go down this column, as we go through this spreadsheet, you will see that your retained earnings will change as you create those entries and do them correctly. It seems like it's a little cut off here, but this is the contributed capital section. Again, if you think back to last week's assignment, contributed capital is that money infused into your project outside of the SAE. So let's take a look at this very first example here. Now, let me pause for a second here before I get going too fast. We have debits and credits. Our asset column here, these are going to be all of our debits. Okay? So anything that we refer to as a debit is going to go over here. But for every debit, meaning every line here is going to have a debit. On the opposite side, we're going to have a credit somewhere. Okay, and so I'll show you what that looks like. Let's take, for example, this first line here. Before ag classes. So this is, you're coming in with this asset. This asset actually happens to be cash. So it says begin with $1,500 in cash. So I'm going to enter in $1,500 in cash. What I'd really like you to see now, and I'm going to, let's see if I can get it to, there you go, hide away from us. What I would like you to be able to see is that down here, I have this formula set up, and it says, does this all balance? And what I'm looking at here is, and if it says off, it's because this debit does not have an equal credit on the other side. Now it says begin with $1,500 in cash to start the SAE project. We can see that this is actually going to be part of contributed capital to our project. If we enter that $1,500 on that side, we now see that we have, does this all balance? And it's okay. Our assets equals our liabilities plus equity. So throughout this example of this project, you will see here that we are going to have debits and credits. If we go down, come down here, and it says purchase the feed for my new show animal using my cash. It says $300. One thing I need you to understand is that that is a negative value. You are losing, right, our assets here. We're not increasing our cash, but we actually expended our cash, so we have less cash on hand. If you see down here, we now have $1,200 of cash on hand. But let's see, where would that play in? Oh, we're going to see that that's actually an expense. And we enter that expense over there, and you'll see that now we balance again. I've had questions in the past that say, well, this is a negative. How come I did not put a negative in over here? Well, my expense actually grew. My expense didn't go down, it grew. So I wanted to put a positive $300 here, but you'll see that here my retained earnings is negative $300. So effectively I've actually lost $300 in my SAE project thus far. Some would argue that I still have $1,200. Yes, but you have $1,200 versus $1,500. So you have less money than what you started with. So you've actually seen a decrease in growth in your overall project. So for this week's assignment, you'll go through here and you'll fill out all of these different lines. You will make sure that you have a debit and a credit for each of them. And with that, you will see that at the end, your goal is that this should all balance. And it should say, okay. Then at the end here, what I'd like you to do is if you take these cells right here and let me get my toolbar back out. Where did it go? Go on, toolbar. There it is. Pin my toolbar back. I merged and centered those cells. What I'd like you to do is in narrative form right here in this sheet, tell me what happens. Was there an overall growth in the project, or was there an overall decrease in growth? Did the project shrink? Was there a loss? Was there a profit? Tell me in narrative form what happened from this student's SAE project. And so that will be your final aspect to this assignment. After you get through all these different entries, you will then come down here and insert in a narrative into this spreadsheet. And you will save this all and then upload this into eCampus. Okay. So hopefully the debits and credits are starting to make a little more sense. A debit is going to be an increase or a decrease. It's not always an increase or it's not always a decrease. You might think, well, when I use my debit card, it's always decreasing my bank account. And that's true. But in this case, it's not a debit card that we're talking about so much. But we are looking at it as a debit from our assets. So is it in the current asset column or the non-current? Keep in mind the difference between current and non-current. The way I always taught my students when we were looking at this is non-current assets are something that has a useful life of greater than 1 year. We look at cash as something that is current. Cash can be expended within 1 year. So keep that in mind. So current versus non-current, we have that same aspect here within our liabilities column. Okay. So as you go through this week, if you do have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me, or even if you need to come by and we can sit down and work through this together, I'd be happy to. As always, I am here to help as I can. Have a great week, Ags, and gig 'em.